Well, hi everyone, and welcome to Pause for Pedagogy. Today is obviously a little bit different. Today, we are joined by each other. It's an opportunity for us to share a little bit about our reflections on this past year and to talk a little bit about what we've learned through our time as co-editors for Pause for Pedagogy. So who's we, you may ask? Well, I'm Lisa Endersby. I'm one of the co-editors for Pause for Pedagogy, and I am also an educational developer in the Teaching Commons at York University in Toronto, Ontario.
Hi, and I'm Dan Jenkins. I'm also co-editor for Pause for Pedagogy, and I'm chair and associate professor of leadership and organizational studies at University of Southern Maine.
So what's really fun about this is Dan and I are very good at scripting and facilitating interviews when there's someone else to talk to and someone else who's written an article. So we've decided to take on the challenge of, curating or collecting all of our thoughts about all of the articles from this past year around the theme of leadership and social justice. And we've written our own article for the first time together to share a little bit about our cumulative or summative insights over the past year. This particular topic I think is of real importance and of real interest to us as we continue to think about leadership and the identities of who people are as leaders and how they act as leaders. And so we wanted to share with our readers and our friends a little bit about what we've learned over the past year. So Dan, I think the big question that we were just chatting about, which could be its own dissertation topic, was really thinking about what have we learned about the intersections of leadership and social justice, and maybe what is socially just leadership. So I'm going to put you on the spot because I enjoy doing that. What do you think socially just leadership is or could be?
Yeah, I think that I guess I'll start by, taking a step or two back when I think about one of the reasons that this theme resonated for us so much was this idea of, leadership educators often having some responsibility in these spaces as, in some way, role models, but also facilitators of conversations in different spaces on college campuses, mainly, where the individuals that we interviewed mostly were, in those contexts, except for, we did have one contributor that worked at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial and Museum in D.C. And so, there's this responsibility to think about, social justice for the greater good, inclusivity, diversity in all its forms, global citizenship, things of this nature that, I feel that as we think about social justice, it's not only just about justice, but it's about embracing, everybody and giving, dignity through dialogue and, really providing, what is sometimes called a safe space, what's sometimes called brave space, and seeing, just how does leadership education and those that are individuals that are leadership educators, exist in that space and again, facilitate those conversations. So as I think about it, I think about how it, really kind of cascades through a lot of the work that we do, because we're not leading in, in an echo chamber. We're leading in a space that is, it includes a lot of individuals from a lot of different places around the globe, and as we go from university to university or campus to campus or organization to organization, there's all these different factors that come into play. And we hope that those individuals that are part of our leadership learning spaces have the ability to go out and lead in those spaces and be effective, but also, we have to be, responsible for, providing them, a place to explore some of those ideas. And then also, one of the other major ideas of this piece was to learn from those individuals that are, really taking some pretty, serious risks in their teaching and really doing some innovative, cutting edge types of teaching. And in some ways it's the techniques that they chose to use, and in other ways it's their own unique lens on the world that they brought into the activities and the approaches that they took. And I think that was one of the most impactful things about this, is learning from these individuals and how they approached some of these ideas in ways that we never would have.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you brought up such a good point about the risks that folks are taking. And it's funny what we might define as a risk and some things that we take for granted. And maybe some of that is tied up into, for me, it was the almost the social part of social justice. I know you were talking a lot about the justice part, and that's important as well. But I remember thinking about socially, which for me is wrapped up in this notion of identity. And it's interesting that some of the risks that folks take may feel like they're wrapped up in who they are, how they perceive themselves, how their students might perceive them, or how their students perceive themselves. Um, and it got me thinking a lot about privilege and the identities that I inhabit. And when I take risks, how comfortable I feel to take risks, or what a risk is to me. And so for me, getting to have these conversations with folks who I get the chance to interact with, their thoughts about leadership or what it means to be a leader were fascinating. Because for us, we kind of take it for granted. We use leader as a noun, we use it as a verb, we use it as an identity. But these folks almost had to do work around, I mean, not to belittle the point, but kind of convince students that they too could lead or be leaders or engage in leadership, because this notion or this definition of leadership, as broad as it's perhaps become, a lot of the articles that I read and a lot of the interviews that I participated in, it was like we're still trying to broaden that definition. We're still trying to open doors. We're still trying to knock down walls, or whatever structural metaphor you want to use. And so to be able to take risks, it was both fascinating, but also a little bit frustrating that they felt that they needed to take these kinds of risks. And they're things that I almost take for granted. You know, the identities that I inhabit are, for the most part, if not entirely, a very privileged set of identities. And so I could talk about, well, leadership could look like this, and just put together a workshop and have this conversation and read this article. But I was really stunned by and humbled by conversations where it just wasn't that simple. And there were lots of intersecting identities and ideas that came up in these conversations. So I wrote a little bit about, in our article that will accompany this video, what it means to inhabit that identity as a leader, and how a lot of our authors may not call themselves a leader, but almost need to lead in order to engage in these conversations or create those safe, brave spaces. So there was an interesting dissonance between, I don't see myself as a leader or don't want to be a leader, yet somehow what I'm doing is leading these types of conversations or leading the creation of these safe spaces. So lots of cognitive dissonance, I suppose, but if nothing else, it is at least bringing more people to the table, and we're having these conversations as opposed to taking some of these ideas for granted.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think one of the, and we wrote about this in the article as well, is, it was, and I appreciate, what you said about this sense of privilege, and there's some intersectionality between what, even, among what, we may see as privilege, and what some of the individuals that, wrote, a part of our series this year felt as privilege, and our own, ideas of that, and how we identify with those types of terms. And we had some dialogue back and forth with many of the authors, where some things that, and perhaps it would, it could even be, it may have been the same way if we had been, if the tables had been turned, but it's hard to know when some of the individuals that were teaching very specific courses, whether it had been, Black or Latinx education, or, there's some individuals that worked in, Hispanic serving institutions, and, certainly with the U.S. Holocaust Memorial. And so some of those spaces, the individuals were speaking from this area of expertise because they had worked in this space for so long, or had grown up in one of those particular cultures. And so when we got drafts of some of the pieces, some of the manuscripts or the article drafts, some things that were, kind of assumed, or very general, we kind of said, no, like, we want specifics here. Like, we want, how do you facilitate this? Like, what do I need to know if I want to do this activity in my class, or if I want to teach somebody and share this resource with somebody who's struggling with facilitating this type of conversation, or getting to the heart of this issue, or trying to get dialogue to a certain level, to really, create these teachable moments for individuals and learners in their leadership courses or programs. And so, and I think we got there with all the articles. It just took a lot of back and forth, and we had to stay true to, kind of what our idea of philosophy pedagogy was. And it's always been this really practitioner forward, approach of, hey, what are you doing that's pretty awesome on your on your campus or in your learning community around, leadership education, and how can you present it in a way that we can take from it and borrow it and bring it into our own learning spaces. And so, yeah, I was really excited that we, were able to, through our network and through, some amazing colleagues, become connected to some just really fantastic authors, and that they were gracious enough to give us their time on a video interview as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think about troubling this idea of expertise and evidence, which is so funny because Dan and I both work in academia, and we publish and we present and we reference everything, and we're well versed in APA, and our authors had to be by the end of it. Sorry. But it's such a point that we spent a lot of time going back and forth around, you don't need to write this as an academic piece, and you don't need to necessarily prove to us that you are an expert in the same way. And theory is great, and it has its place, and it's inspired a lot of really important conversation. And there are lots of great references in the articles that we've shared that speak to more of the theory around leadership or leading. But the expertise was really in the experience, which was so cool to see. And just as Dan was saying, there was a lot of back and forth on both of our parts, teasing apart the question, yeah, but what does that look like? How do you do that? How do you do that with students? We talk a lot about, well, you should help students do this, or it's important to do this, and it is, but what does that actually look like? And what does that look like for different groups of students? What does that look like in different communities? Which is really what we were trying to get at, particularly here, where we weren't trying to think about capital L leadership anymore. We were trying to think about what it looks like in all these different spaces and places. But it was interesting. And if I could be so bold, I think one of the things I love about this series is that we give people that space to demonstrate expertise or experience in a different way, that they can actually tell their stories. And it doesn't have, like, we trust you, and we know that you've done this work and that you've got data just from having these experiences. So it's the narrative approach has been probably the most powerful thing to me, again, to learn from other people's stories, which is often how I learn best, but also to pull that apart for socially just leadership or social justice in leadership, the power of narrative, which seems to cut across lots of different spaces and places. And I don't know if it necessarily mitigates this notion of privilege that can come from things like, well, you have to have theory and, cite your sources, and which sources are you citing? And that's a whole other conversation. But at least here, the sources that we had were those who have lived and are living these realities that are perhaps different from ours. And that kind of awareness building, I think, has already begun to change how I approach the work that I do in my own campus.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your thoughts about kind of this narrative piece and, the dialogical nature of leadership. I mean, so many cultures learn through stories, and I think, we're just one of them. And Philosophy Pedagogy has, become this great, conduit for sharing stories about teaching and leadership education spaces that span the globe. And so this is just it's been a great series, and really appreciated the opportunity that we've had to do this together in 2019. So
yeah, and I guess we're doing it again, and we'll do it at least one more time.
At least one more time.
One more time. So this is probably the part in the interviews where we would plug, make sure you read and you access and you watch and you listen. But there'll be a call going out for 2020 authors pretty soon. We're probably going to be expanding on this theme a little bit and really thinking about the different narratives and different people and different perspectives that we bring to the series. I recognize how incredibly broad that is, but maybe it's meant to be, at least right now. But keep on the lookout for a call for authors for 2020. This is certainly something that we have found great value in, and we hope you have too. Any questions can certainly come to us. There'll be a more formal call coming out through ILA soon. But, over the holidays, if you have any free time and are looking to do some light reading next to the fire, I think the Pause for Pedagogy archives would be a great resource. So have a look, have a listen, and thanks again for supporting the work that we do. We are looking forward to doing more of it in 2020.